On a Wednesday morning in October of 1995, a $500,000 crane fell over at a bridge construction site in Carroll County, Iowa. And the only man who could fix the problem was 78 years old and drove a machine built before the stock market crash. Let me set the scene because the setting matters. The Middle Raccoon River crosses Carroll County in a long, lazy series of bends through flat Iowa farmland. In 95, the county was replacing a two-lane bridge on County Road D25, a Depression-era concrete span that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of cement. The contract went to Mercer Construction out of Des Moines, a mid-size firm that had been building bridges across Iowa for 30 years. The project manager was a man named Keith Scanlon. Keith was 45 years old, ex-military, ran his sites like an officer runs a platoon, everything scheduled, everything documented, everything by the book. He had a reputation for bringing projects in on time and under budget, which is why Mercer gave him the Carroll County job. The bridge was supposed to be done by Thanksgiving. Keith intended to make that deadline. His key piece of equipment was a Liebherr LTM 11160, a mobile crane manufactured in Germany, shipped to Iowa in 3 pieces and assembled on site over 2 days. It was the crown jewel of Mercer's fleet, $500,000 of hydraulic precision. It could lift 160 metric tons. It could extend its boom 200 ft into the air. It had more computing power in its control cab than the Apollo spacecraft. Keith loved that crane the way some men love a particular horse. He'd used it on 4 bridges already. It had never failed him. On October 11, 1995, the crane was setting the third of 6 steel girders across the river. Each girder weighed 42 tons and had to be lifted from a flatbed truck on the east bank, swung over the river and lowered onto the bridge abutments on both sides. It was precision work, the kind of work the Liebherr was designed for. The crane was positioned on the east bank on what the surveyors had certified as stable ground. 4 hydraulic outriggers, steel legs that extend from the crane's base and press down on wide pads to stabilize the machine, were deployed and locked. The operator, a man named Dale Story, who'd been running cranes for 22 years, checked his levels, checked his load charts, checked the wind speed, and gave the thumbs up. The lift started perfectly. The girder rose off the flatbed, swung slowly over the river, and began its descent toward the abutments. Dale was watching his load indicator, 42 tons, well within the crane's capacity at this radius, when he felt something that no crane operator ever wants to feel. The ground moved, not an earthquake, something worse. The east bank of the Middle Raccoon River, which the surveyors had certified as stable, which had supported the crane for 3 days of lifts without a problem, suddenly decided it wasn't stable anymore. The outrigger pad on the riverside, the one bearing the most weight during the swing, punched through the surface crust and sank 18 in into soft clay in less than 2 seconds. Dale dropped the girder. It splashed into the shallow river and buried itself in the mud. 42 tons of steel, $26,000 gone. But the girder was the least of the problems. The crane was tipping. With one outrigger sunk and the boom still extended, the Liebherr began a slow, sickening lean toward the river. Dale killed the engine and scrambled out of the cab. The crane's 8-ton counterweight, designed to balance loads during lifts, was now working against the machine, pulling the back end up as the front end went down. The crane fell in slow motion, not a crash, more like a giant lying down. The boom hit the shallow water with a sound like a cannon shot, sending a plume of mud and river water 50 ft into the air. The cab rotated 90 degrees as the machine settled onto its side. The counterweight stood up in the air like a monument to miscalculation. It took about 8 seconds from the first shift to the final position. By the time the dust settled and the river stopped sloshing, a $500,000 crane was lying on its side on the bank of the Middle Raccoon River with its boom in the water and its outrigger buried 3 ft deep in clay that nobody had tested properly. Keith Scanlon stood on the bank and stared at his crane the way a man stares at a car wreck, except this wasn't a car. This was $500,000 of irreplaceable equipment lying in the mud of a river that was supposed to have a bridge over it by Thanksgiving. Dale was fine, shaken, muddy, but uninjured. The girder in the river would need to be fished out, but was probably undamaged. The crane, however, was a different story entirely. A Liebherr LTM 160 on its side with one outrigger buried in soft ground next to a river. That's not a problem you solve with a phone call and a tow truck. That's a problem that requires other cranes to solve. Bigger cranes, cranes that can reach the machine without sinking into the same soft ground that brought down the first one, and that's where the trouble really started. Keith called Mercer's equipment manager in Des Moines. The equipment manager called 2 crane companies, one in Omaha, one in Minneapolis. Both sent inspectors to assess the situation. Both came back with the same answer. The ground conditions on the east bank were too unstable to support another crane large enough to right the lever. The clay layer extended at least 60 ft back from the river. Any crane heavy enough to lift 160 tons would sink into the same soft ground before it could set up. You need to stabilize the ground first, the Omaha inspector said. Bring in fill material, compact it, let it settle, then bring in a larger crane. How long? Keith asked. 3 to 4 weeks for the ground prep. Then another week for crane mobilization and the lift, 5 weeks. Keith's Thanksgiving deadline was 6 weeks away. The bridge project, which had been running smoothly for 4 months, was about to blow its schedule, its budget, and Keith Scanlon's reputation. What about a helicopter? Someone asked. Keith had heard this suggestion before on other jobs. The answer was always the same. The Liebherr weighs 160 tons rigged. The heaviest helicopter lift ever performed in the US was about 25 tons. You'd need 6 helicopters working simultaneously, which is physically impossible. Drain the area, pump the water table down to firm up the soil. We're next to a river, you'd be pumping forever. Insurance write-off. Keith closed his eyes. Riding off a $500,000 crane was career death. Merker would never forgive it. His reputation would never recover, and the bridge project would be delayed until spring. For 4 days, the Liebherr lay on its side while engineers argued about soil mechanics and crane companies argued about liability, and Keith Scanlon argued with his own blood pressure. On the morning of the 5th day, a John Deere tractor pulled up to the edge of the construction site. Let me tell you about Harlon Meyer, because understanding the man is the only way to understand what happened next. Harlon was 78 years old. He had farmed 480 acres in Carroll County for 53 years since 1942 when his father had a stroke, and Harlon came home from his job at the meat packing plant in Des Moines to take over the farm at age 25. He'd been farming ever since. Through the post-war boom, through the 60s expansion, through the 80s crisis, he'd seen equipment come and go. Horses to tractors, gas to diesel, 2W-wheel drive to 4-wheel drive, analog to computerized. He'd used some of the new technology and ignored the rest, choosing his tools the way he chose his friends based on reliability, not fashion. Harlon's farm bordered the construction site on the north side. He'd been watching the bridge project from his kitchen window for 4 months. He'd watched the crane arrive, he'd watched the lifts, he'd watched the crane go over, and he'd watched 4 days of engineers standing around with clipboards trying to figure out how to pick it up. On the 5th morning, he drove his John Deere 440 to the site, parked it at the fence line, and walked over to where Keith Scanlon was standing with 2 engineers and a stack of soil test reports that had arrived too late to prevent the disaster. "Morning," Harlon said. Keith barely looked at him. "Site's closed, insurance, I'm your neighbor, farm on the north side." Harlon nodded toward the tipped crane. "I've been watching, looks like you're stuck." "We're not stuck, we're assessing options." "You've been assessing options for 5 days, your crane's still in the mud." Keith looked at Harlon for the first time. Overalls, mud boots, white hair under a cap that had the ghost of a seed company logo bleached away by decades of sun. 78 years old and lame as a fence rail. "What's your point?" "I can write that crane." The words landed like a joke. Nobody had told. One of the engineers made a sound that was half cough, half laugh. Keith's mouth opened and then closed and then opened again. "You can ride a 160-ton crane," Keith repeated. "Not by myself, with my crawler." "You're what?" "My grandfather's Caterpillar, 60 model, 1928. We've had it on the farm since new. She'll pull that crane up like she's pulling a stump." Keith Scanlon started to laugh. Not a small laugh, a real laugh, the kind that bends a man at the waist and makes his hard hat tip forward. The engineers joined in. A couple of workers who'd been listening from the trailer steps added their contributions. "A Caterpillar 60, Keith said, wiping his eyes. "From 1928, you want to ride a Liebherr crane, 160 tons with a farm tractor from the roaring 20s. That's about the size of it," Harlon said. His expression hadn't changed. His voice hadn't changed. He stood exactly the way he'd been standing, hands at his sides, shoulders square, looking at Keith with the patience of a man who has been underestimated before and stopped caring about it around 1960. "The Caterpillar 60 weighs 10 tons, Keith said, his voice shifting from amusement to the gentle condescension of a man explaining physics to a child. "Your crawler weighs 10 tons. My crane weighs 160, you understand the difference. You can't pull something that weighs 16 times more than you, you're not lifting it." Harlon said. "You're riding it, there's a difference. That crane is on its side. Center of gravity is already past the tipping point. All you need to do is get it started, rotate it maybe 30 degrees and gravity does the rest. Once it's past center, it falls back on its tracks under its own weight." Keith stopped laughing. "The pulling force to start that rotation with the boom and the water creating drag is roughly 12 to 15 tons, Harlon continued as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "The Cat 60 puts out 65 horsepower at the drawbar. She runs through a 3-speed gearbox. In first gear she pulls 22,000 lb at a walking pace. That's 11 tons of sustained pull, but that's on flat ground. I'll be pulling uphill on the angle, which reduces my effective force, but I only need to get the rotation started. Once the crane passes its balance point, I back off and let physics finish the job." The engineers looked at each other. One of them, a younger man who'd clearly done well in his statics class, pulled out a calculator and started punching numbers. Keith stared at Harlon. "How does a farmer know the tipping force calculation for a Liebherr crane?" "I don't know Liebherr cranes," Harlon said. "I know center of gravity, weight distribution, and how things tip. I've been pulling stumps, riding overturned equipment, and dragging stuck machinery out of mud for 53 years. Physics doesn't change depending on the price tag." He paused. "Your crane companies won't bring a bigger crane because the ground's too soft." "They're right. Another heavy crane would sink, but my crawler is different. She's 10 tons on 2 tracks, each track 12 ft long and 20 in wide. That's 40 square ft of ground contact. My ground pressure is about 500 lb per square foot. Your crane's outrigger pads put down 3,000 lb per square foot on the same soil. That's why your outrigger punched through and my tracks won't. The engineer with the calculator looked up. He's right about the ground pressure. Keith Scanlon stood in the mud of a riverbank looking at a 78-year-old farmer who had just explained the engineering problem better than the two engineers holding six-figure degrees. If this doesn't work, Keith started, then you've lost nothing but an afternoon. Harlon said, I'm not charging you. If it works, make a donation to the Carroll County Historical Society. They helped me restore the machine. Keith looked at the crane lying on its side, losing him $20,000 a day in project delays. He looked at his engineers who had been arguing for 5 days without a solution. He looked at Harlon Meyer who had a solution and asked for nothing. Bring your museum piece, Keith said, but his voice had lost its mockery. Let me tell you about the Caterpillar because she's the reason this story exists. The Caterpillar 60 was built in Peoria, Illinois in 1928, 1 year before the stock market crash, 5 years before the Dust Bowl. It was the largest crawler tractor Caterpillar made at the time. 10 tons of cast iron and forged steel, powered by a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that produced 65 horsepower at the belt and about 35 at the drawbar. Rode on 2 steel tracks, each 12 ft long and 20 in wide, studded with grousser bars that gripped any surface. Harlan's grandfather Otto Meyer had bought the machine new in 1928 for $2,800, more money than most farms in Carroll County earned in a year. Otto was a German immigrant who'd homesteaded the farm in 1892, and believed that the right tool maintained properly would outlast the man who bought it. And the man after that, he was right. The Caterpillar had been on the Meyer farm for 67 years when the Liebherr crane fell over. It had cleared stumps, pulled combines out of mud, dragged buildings, moved grain bins, and done every piece of heavy work that 3 generations of Meyer farmers had asked of it. Otto used it until 1952 when he died at 83. Harlan's father used it until 61 when his stroke put him in a wheelchair. Harlan had used it ever since. The machine had been rebuilt twice, once in 46 after the war and once in 79 when Harron and a retired machinist in Carroll spent a winter replacing bearings, rebuilding the magneto, reboring the cylinders, and replacing every seal and gasket. The restoration cost $3,400 in parts and took 5 months of weekend work. Since then, Harlan had fired it up every month, run it around the farmyard, kept the tracks greased and the engine tuned. He'd used it for heavy work on the farm, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, and he'd taken it to the Carroll County Fair every summer for the antique machinery display. Most people who saw the Caterpillar 60 thought it was a museum piece, a relic, something to look at and photograph and then go home and forget. Harlan knew better. He knew what the machine could do because he'd spent 53 years asking it to do things that modern equipment wouldn't or couldn't. The Caterpillar 60 didn't have a computer that limited its output. It didn't have sensors that cut power when the load exceeded a threshold. It didn't protect itself from overexertion. The way modern machines do, it just pulled. It pulled until the job was done or something broke. And in 67 years on the Meyer farm, nothing had ever broken that Harlan couldn't fix in an afternoon. It took Harlan 2 hours to bring the Caterpillar to the construction site. The machine moved at a stately 4 m an hour on its steel tracks, chewing up the gravel road with its grousser bars and leaving a trail that looked like a tank had passed. Harlan drove it from the farm across the county road and down the access path to the river. The construction crew heard it coming before they saw it. The sound was distinctive, a deep rhythmic barking from the 4-cylinder engine, louder and raw than any modern machine. The kind of sound that vibrates in your chest and tells you something serious is approaching. When the Caterpillar 60 crested the small rise above the construction site, the crew stopped working and stared. The machine was enormous for its era, taller than a man at the radiator cap, wider than a pickup truck, riding on those massive steel tracks that seemed to grip the earth with authority rather than merely resting on it. The engine was exposed. Cylinders, manifolds, spark plugs, all visible, all working, all making noise. There was no cab, no roof, no windshield, just a steel seat bolted to the frame and Harlon Meyer sitting on it, one hand on the steering clutch, the other on the throttle, looking exactly like what he was, a man who had been doing this longer than most of the crew had been alive. Jesus Christ, one of the workers said. Is that a tractor or a tank? It's both, said the engineer with the calculator. He'd been reading about Caterpillar 60s on the trailer computer for the past hour, ever since Harlan's ground pressure math had checked out. It's a Caterpillar 60. Same basic design as the machines that inspired the British to build tanks in World War I. The army used them to haul artillery in France. Keith Scandon watched the Caterpillar approach with an expression that had shifted from amusement to uncertainty to something approaching respect. The machine was bigger than he'd expected, heavier looking, more serious. It didn't look like a museum piece anymore. It looked like something that had been built to do exactly what Harlan said it could do. Harlan positioned the caterpillar about 150 ft from the tipped crane on the uphill side, solid ground, away from the soft clay of the riverbank. He killed the engine, climbed down, and began uncoiling a chain from the back of the machine. Not just any chain. A logging chain forged steel links as thick as a man's thumb, rated for 30 tons. The same chain Otto Meyer had bought with the machine in 28, 67 years old, and not a weak link in it. Harlan waded through the soft ground to the crane, carefully testing each step, reading the soil the way he'd read soil his entire life. He hooked the chain to the crane's main frame at a point he'd calculated would produce the maximum rotational force when the crawler pulled. Not the top, not the boom, the frame. About 2/3 of the way up from the ground, the lever point that would translate horizontal pull into rotational torque. Why there? The engineer asked, watching. If I hook too high, I'm fighting the full weight. If I hook too low, I don't get enough rotation. That point right there gives me the best mechanical advantage. The crane wants to rotate around its tracks. I'm helping it do what it already wants to do. He waded back, covered in mud to his thighs, and climbed onto the caterpillar. He fired the engine. The four-cylinder gasoline engine coughed, caught, and settled into its barking rhythm, a sound that hadn't been heard at a construction site since before most of the crew was born. Keith stood with his arms crossed. The engineers stood with their calculators. The crew stood with their phones out, because if this was going to be a disaster, they wanted it on video. And if it was going to be a miracle, they wanted that on video too. Ready? Harlan called out. Go ahead, Keith said. He didn't sound confident. He didn't sound mocking either. He sounded like a man watching something he couldn't predict. Harlan put the caterpillar in first gear. The tracks began to move. Let me tell you about the next 4 minutes, because they're the reason every person at that construction site still talks about this day. The chain went taut, not with a snap, with a slow, steady tightening. The steel links straightening one by one as the caterpillar's tracks bit into the ground and began to pull. The grouser bars, steel cleats welded to each track link, dug into the earth like teeth, finding purchase, gripping solid ground beneath the soft surface for 10 seconds. Nothing visible happened. The chain was tight. The caterpillar was pulling. The crane wasn't moving, but something was happening that the eyes couldn't see. The crane's center of gravity was shifting infinitesimally, at first a fraction of a degree of rotation, invisible to anyone standing on the bank, but measurable by the strain gauges on the chain if anyone had thought to put them there. Harlan kept the throttle steady. He wasn't trying to jerk the crane over that would snap the chain and possibly topple the crawler. He was applying constant, patient force, the same kind of force his grandfather had applied when pulling stumps in the 20s. Not fast, not flashy, just relentless. At the 202 mark, the crane moved, not much, an inch, maybe two. A slight rotation of the massive frame around its grounded tracks, the upper structure lifting fractionally from the mud. A sound like a groan came from the crane's frame, metal stressed by forces it hadn't been designed to experience from this direction. It's moving, someone said quietly, like saying it too loud might jinx it. Harlan didn't hear. He was focused on the caterpillar, on the engine sound, on the track tension, on the feel of the machine through the steel seat. He pushed the throttle forward a 4 in, or the caterpillar's engine note deepened. The tracks gripped harder, throwing small clouds of earth behind them. The chain hummed with tension. The crane moved again, 5 degrees of rotation. Then 8, the boom began to lift from the water, slowly dripping, rising like a mechanical arm reaching for the sky. Holy, Keith Scandon said he wasn't laughing anymore. 10 degrees 15. The crane's counterweight was beginning to work in Harlan's favor now. Its mass, which had helped tip the crane in the first place, was now pulling the machine back toward upright. As the center of gravity shifted 20 degrees 25, Harlan could feel it. The moment when the crane's own weight began to do the work, the resistance on the chain eased. The caterpillar's engine note light. The crane was past its balance point. Committed to falling back the other way, Harlan eased the throttle back. Up, she's going, he said to nobody in particular. The crane fell back onto its tracks with a shuddering impact that shook the ground and sent a wave of mud across the riverbank. It rocked once forward, then back, and settled upright, battered. Muddy, one outrigger bent, but standing on its own tracks for the first time in 5 days. Silence, absolute silence. 25 construction workers, 2 engineers, 1 project manager, and 1 farmer on a 67-year-old machine, all staring at a crane that was standing upright and shouldn't have been. Then the cheering started. It hit like a wave. Men shouting, whistling, slapping hard hats on their thighs, pumping fists in the air. 2 workers hugged each other. The engineer with the calculator threw it in the air and caught it. Someone blasted a truck horn. Keith Scanlon didn't cheer. He walked slowly, deliberately from the bank to where Heron sat on the caterpillar, engine still idling, chain slack on the ground. Keith stood at the base of the machine and looked up at Harlan. He didn't say anything for a long time. The cheering continued behind him, but between the 2 men there was silence. How much do I owe you? Keith finally said, donation to the Historical Society. Whatever you think is fair. What's fair for saving a $500,000 crane and a $20 million bridge project? 10,000 would make them pretty happy. They're trying to build a machinery barn for the antique displays at the fair. Keith nodded. He reached up and shook Harlan's hand, a handshake that started formal and ended long. I want to ask you something. Keith said, your engineers, your crane companies, people with degrees and million-dollar budgets couldn't solve this problem in 5 days. How did you solve it in 4 minutes? Harlan shut down the engine. The sudden silence was as dramatic as the rescue itself. He climbed down from the machine slowly, 78-year-old joints protesting, and leaned against the caterpillar's track the way a man leans against something he trusts. Your engineers were trying to lift the crane, Harlon said. They wanted to pick it up. That's the modern way, apply force greater than the weight of the object. But I wasn't trying to lift it, I was trying to tip it. Different problem, different math. He tapped the crawler's track. This machine was built in 1928. No computers, no hydraulics, no sensors, just an engine, a gearbox, and two steel tracks. It doesn't know how much it's supposed to pull. It doesn't have a load limiter. It doesn't shut itself down when things get hard. It just pulls until I tell it to stop. Your modern cranes, they're smarter than this machine. They protect themselves. They calculate loads and refuse to exceed them. That's good engineering for normal operations. But when you need to do something that isn't normal, when you need to pull past what the computer says is safe, the smart machine won't let you. My dumb machine will. Keith was quiet for a moment. My grandfather ran equipment, he said. Heavy equipment before computers. He used to say that the operator was the safety system. Your grandfather was right. The man is the computer and the man has to be smarter than the machine. Whether the machine is 67 years old or 6 months old, let me tell you about the aftermath. Because the story doesn't end at the riverbank. The Liebherr crane needed repairs. A bent outrigger, some hydraulic line damage, cosmetic dents, but nothing structural. It was back in service within 2 weeks. Keith Scandon made his Thanksgiving deadline. The bridge opened on schedule. Keith wrote a check for $15,000 to the Carroll County Historical Society, $5,000 more than Harlon asked for. He wrote a letter to Mercer Construction's president explaining what had happened and recommending that the company donate an additional $10,000 to the society. M. Kerr agreed. The society used the $25,000 to build a proper machinery barn at the Carroll County Fairgrounds. The Caterpillar 60 was the first machine displayed in the new barn. Harlon Meyer continued farming until 2001 when he was 84. He handed the operation to his son Robert, who'd been farming alongside him for 30 years. The Caterpillar was part of the inheritance, just as it had been when Otto passed it to Harlan's father. And when Harlan's father passed it to Heron, Robert still fires it up once a month, still takes it to the county fair. Still gets calls from people with equipment stuck in places where modern machines can't reach or can't risk going. In 2004, Robert used the Caterpillar to pull a combine out of a creek bed where it had slid during harvest. The combine's owner, a young farmer in his 30s, watched a 76-year-old machine rescue his $200,000 combine and said something that Robert has never forgot. My combine has GPS, auto steer, yield monitors, and a satellite uplink. Your tractor has a seat and a chain, and yours just saved mine. That's about right, Robert said. Harlon Meyer died in 2009 at the age of 92. His funeral was held at the same church where his grandfather Otto had been baptized in 1894. Keith Scanlon came retired, now living in Des Moines, but he drove 2 hours to Carroll County because some debts aren't paid with money. That man saved my career, Keith told the family. And he did it with a machine older than my father. I spent my whole life believing that newer was better. Heron taught me that the question isn't how old the machine is. The question is whether the man running it knows what he's doing. The Caterpillar 60 is still on the Meyer farm. Robert's son Thomas, the fourth generation, learned to drive it at 14, the same age Harlon learned, the same age Harlan's father learned. The machine has been in the family for 97 years now. It has outlasted 3 generations of farmers, dozens of modern tractors, and at least one $500,000 crane. The engine still starts on the third pull. The tracks still grip. The Grouser bars still bite into earth like they did the day Otto Meyer drove the machine off the dealer's lot in 1928. And every time someone says that old thing can't help, every time an engineer calculates the limits and a computer says no and a modern machine protects itself from what needs to be done, the Meyer family fires up the Caterpillar, hooks a chain, and proves them wrong. The engineers laughed. The crane fell over. The old machine pulled it back up. That's what happens when you build something that doesn't know when to quit.